Chapter 26 Good Friday. "Amon!" Benjamin hissed. "What do you see?" Benjamin tried to shove his older friend out of the way so he could look for himself, but Amon held his ground. On the other side of Amon, Tamar waited. "Yes, tell us what is happening." "Shh!" Amon hushed them. "I'm trying to listen." Amon turned his attention back to the crack at the corner of the wall and peeked through. They were outside the courtyard of Caiaphas again, trying to find Jesus. Amon didn't dare enter the courtyard for fear that the same guard would be there and recognize him. It was early morning now, but still dark. The sun would not rise for another 2 hours. After they had left the garden, the three friends had gone back to Amon's house so he could change into his own clothes and tell his mother of the evening's events. Then they went to the temple in search of Jesus, but found out that he had been taken to the house of Caiaphas. Many people were gathered inside the courtyard there, including all of the Sanhedrin. "Jesus is just standing there," Amon reported in a whisper. The crack in the wall was so narrow that he had to move his head back and forth to see different parts of the courtyard. "He's standing on one side of the high priest's throne, and the Sanhedrin is sitting on the other side. Wait, someone is standing up to testify." A man in ragged clothing was now starting to speak. Amon put his ear to the crack in order to better hear what was going on. "I saw Jesus drinking human blood and calling on Satan," the man charged. Amon peeked back through the crack when a different voice began to testify. "I heard him tell his disciples to kill all the priests so he could take over Israel and Judah," an old woman with several missing teeth claimed. One by one, a whole series of people, most of them looking like thieves from the prison or beggars from the street, testified against Jesus with such outrageous charges that Amon thought no sane man could possibly believe them. And each of them, Amon was sure, left the court with one of the high priest's stolen coins in his or her palm. As each of the people testified, Gamaliel or Joseph of Arimathea would question them, exposing the testimony as lies. "Let me look," Tamar whispered, and Amon stepped aside. Tamar gasped when she put her eye to the crack. "He looks like he's been beaten." A moment later she jumped back from the wall. "Peter is in there," she cried. "Perhaps he knows where my father is." Without waiting to discuss it, Tamar ran up the street and turned into the courtyard. Amon jumped back up to the wall and put his eye to the crack. Peter, a disciple of Jesus, was huddled around a fire on the far side of the compound with several guards and servants. Amon watched as Tamar ran up to him. At first, Peter seemed surprised to see Tamar, but then he turned his back and shook his head. Amon couldn't figure out what was going on as Peter kept walking away from Tamar, waving her away with his hand and shaking his head no. Tamar appeared to be pleading with Peter as she pointed at Jesus. "I don't know him!" Peter yelled loud enough for Amon to hear. Tamar looked confused and slowly walked away. Amon continued to watch until he heard Tamar return. He turned to face her but didn't know what to say. Tamar sat against the wall, then buried her head in her arms and cried. "What's going on?" Benjamin asked, but neither Amon nor Tamar answered. Amon turned back to the scene in the courtyard, just in time to see Gamaliel humiliate the last of the false witnesses. Caiaphas jumped up from his throne, his face an angry red in the torchlight. Turning to Jesus, he screamed, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are Christ, the Son of God." A hush swept across the courtyard, and Amon pushed his face so tightly against the crack that the bricks cut into his skin. He watched as Jesus slowly raised his head, his hair wet with sweat, and could it be blood? Jesus turned his eyes toward Caiaphas, and Amon saw in those eyes a sadness that surprised him, because he could tell that Jesus was sad for Caiaphas. Amon held his breath as he waited for Jesus to reply. Finally, Jesus spoke. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus said. "But I say to all of you," he continued, turning now to all the people in the courtyard, and to Peter, "in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Caiaphas tilted his head back and screamed so loudly that it literally scared the rats out of the sewer. Amon quickly checked around his feet to make sure none of them were there. Then he turned back to the wall. Caiaphas grabbed the two sides of his outer tunic and ripped it apart in anger. "Do you hear?" he screamed at the Sanhedrin. "He has spoken blasphemy. What more evidence do you need?" The entire courtyard erupted in chaos, with people yelling and arguing and ripping their clothes. "Now what do you think?" Caiaphas yelled at the members of the Sanhedrin, and every one of them except Gamaliel and Joseph yelled, "Kill him!" Amon turned away from the wall and slumped down next to Tamar, too shocked even to cry. "Why doesn't he do something?" Amon wondered out loud. "If he truly is the Messiah, why doesn't he free himself?" At last Benjamin got a turn at the wall. He stood on tiptoes and peered through the crack, watching the chaos on the other side. After a few moments he turned back to Amon and said, "Uh-oh, I think they're coming." It took Amon a moment to realize what his friend had said, but then it hit him. He jumped to his feet, pulled Tamar to hers, and said, "Come, we must not be seen here." Then, turning up the street with Benjamin and Tamar close behind, he said with bitterness, "I guess we will have to find some other way to save my father." As Amon knocked loudly on the wooden door of Saul's home behind him, toward the valley of the cheesemakers, he heard a rooster crow. Glancing to his right, he saw that the sun was just peeking over the top of the Mount of Olives. He knocked again. A muffled voice yelled something from inside the house. Then the door opened and Saul stood, bleary-eyed, with his hair pointing every which way. He blinked several times, then said, "Amon, what are you doing here in the middle of the night?" Amon pushed his way past Saul, not even waiting for an invitation. Tamar and Benjamin followed a little more hesitantly. "I must have your help," Amon said without introduction. Saul closed the door and turned. "Your father is to be executed today," he said, guessing the reason for Amon's visit, "and you want me to use my Rhodan citizenship to stop it." Amon looked at Saul, his eyebrows creased in the pleading of a desperate man. "Will you help?" he asked. Saul opened his mouth several times, trying to find the right words. "Amon," he said finally, "there is nothing I can do. Pilate knows well that I am a citizen, but hates me for the influence I have. But there must be something you can try. You cannot just let them kill my father for something he did not do." Saul shook his head slowly, then stopped. "Perhaps one thing," he said, and Amon looked up at his friend in expectation. "It is a small thing, but perhaps—" "What?" Amon shouted. "Tell me! Anything will be better than the nothing I have now." Saul hesitated, and Amon could tell his friend put little faith in what he was about to say. "There is a man," he said finally, "an old man, a friend of my father's from long ago." Saul paused again, and Amon urged him on. "What about him? How can he help?" "I do not know if he can help at all," Saul said with a sigh. "But in his youth he helped to build the temple and the fortress of Antonia. Perhaps," he said, very unsure of himself, "perhaps he knows of a way to help your father escape." Amon stared at Saul. "That's it?" he cried. "An old man who won't know anything?" "I know it's not much," Saul said, pain covering his face, "but it is all I have." Tamar spoke for the first time since entering the house. "If that is all you have," she said quietly, and more to Amon than to Saul, "then that is where we will start." Yes, forgive me," Amon said, trying to wave away his frustration with his hands. "I know you would do more if you could." "That I truly would. Now give me a moment to dress and I will take you to my friend." The sun was just rising above the temple when Saul led the other three across the city. He turned up a narrow street, then knocked at a small nondescript door. A moment later it slowly opened, and there stood Redbeard, the old man Amon had met at the pool of Bethsaida. "Greetings, Melchi," Saul greeted the old man. "I have brought friends in need of help. May we come in?" Melchi looked at Amon, thought for a moment, then said, I do not believe your young friend will find my counsel of benefit. Saul looked at Amon, surprised, but Amon addressed himself to the elder. Please forgive my earlier ignorance. I now know the man Jesus for myself, and I believe him to be the Messiah. Melchi studied Amon for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. Saul was very confused, but asked no questions. Instead, he started to explain. This is my friend Amon, and his father is a prisoner in Antonia. Melchi completed the sentence. Yes, I know of these affairs. How may I help? Saul explained what he had in mind, and Melchi sat back, nodding his head. Yes, after a moment, it might be possible, though dangerous. He leaned forward again and looked Amon in the eye. Very dangerous, he said again, and difficult, he added. Without blinking, Amon said, I am a man, and a man does not run from a thing just because it is dangerous or difficult. If there is something that can help my father, I will do it, no matter the cost to me. Melchi nodded. Well then, he said, we had better get busy. You have little time. The old man pulled out a parchment and quickly drew the plans that were forming in his head. At each point, Amon would ask a question, clarifying every detail of the scheme. But don't think you will have help from your friend here, Malachi said, nodding to Saul. He wouldn't make it 10 strides. The passage is much too small. It may even be too tight for you. I will make it, Amon said, though his insides quivered just a bit. The women of Jerusalem were just opening their shutters and emptying their chamber pots as Saul, Amon, and the 2 children went first to Amon's house, where he filled his backpack with tools, and then to the Temple Mount. The pavement stones were slippery from dew and from the moss that grew between them here in the shadow of the temple. At last they reached the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. Here the wall that formed the foundation of the temple rose higher than a juniper tree. It would take 20 men standing on each other's shoulders to reach the top. Amon only had to make it half of that distance. The group gathered at the base of the wall, keeping out of sight of the Roman soldiers standing guard at the fortress around the corner. Very well, Amon, Saul said. It is time for you to go. And me too, Benjamin said indignantly. No, my friend, Amon said. You cannot come with me. This adventure I must take alone. But I want to go, Benjamin insisted. We always do things together. Yes, but this time you must not. Amon searched for a kind way to disappoint his friend. Benjamin, I am a man and must make my own way and my own choices, but the law says you are still a child and I cannot allow you to go. Benjamin started to pounce, so Amon said, Besides, your mother would feed me to her dogs if I allowed you to do this. Benjamin smiled just a bit and said, No, she would feed you to her chickens, he said, and then laughed at his own joke. Amon smiled, then looked at Tamar. I would go with you if I could, Tamar said to him. I know, Amon answered, then gave her a hug. Very well then, Saul said. The children and I will stay here and watch for guards until you're safely inside. Amon embraced his friend. Thank you for your help. I will see you tonight with my father. Saul shook his head. No, my young friend. Once you have freed him, you must flee to the hills of Judea. I will bring you food and water at the rock where we last camped, and eventually I will bring your family. But you can never again return to Jerusalem. Both of your lives will be forfeit the moment Caiaphas finds you. Amon gazed sadly at the city which had been his home most of his life. Then that is as it must be, he said finally. With one last look at his friends, he kicked off his sandals, lifted his backpack filled with tools and a torch, turned to the wall, and started climbing. The moss-covered stones were slippery and so perfectly fitted that there was barely a finger-hold between them. By working his way up slowly, though, Amon was able to find a toe-hold here and a finger-hold there. He climbed up into the wind, and its wintry grasp turned Amon's fingers and toes to ice, making it even more difficult to hold on. Amon had climbed about the height of 3 men when he heard laughter from the direction of the fortress. He stopped climbing and sucked himself in against the building just as 2 Roman soldiers came around the corner below him. Worried about his friends, but not daring to even look, Amon listened intently. Thoughts of danger there were in screaming through his brain. "You!" one of the soldiers roared, and Amon wondered if the Roman was talking to him or to Saul. "What are you doing here?" "Forgive us," Amon heard Saul's voice say. "We were just looking for mushrooms in the morning dew." "Father, I found one," Amon heard Benjamin say. "Mother will be so pleased." "Yes, son, she will." Amon's heart pounded, and as he prayed that the Romans would not look up or realize that Saul was far too young to be father to these children. "Move along," he heard the soldier bark. "No one is allowed near the fortress." "Oh, I am sorry," Saul said, and Amon could imagine him backing away. "I did not realize this is a restricted area. Come, children." "Yes, father," Benjamin and Tamar said. "Oh, sir," Amon heard Saul cry out, "I should have told you immediately. I saw 3 zealots with their swords drawn not a few moments ago. They went that way." Amon could not see which way Saul had pointed, but from the sound of the soldiers' running feet, he knew it must have been toward Antonia. "Climb, Amon," Saul's urgent whisper came a moment later, "and may Jehovah be with you." Amon didn't answer, but did as he was told. He continued climbing even as he heard the footsteps of his friends retreating up the street. A few minutes later, Amon had reached his goal. Halfway up the Temple Mount, in a place the designers must have thought no one could reach, was the end of a drainage tunnel. Although it was dry now, during the rainy season water would gush from this tunnel. Amon slowly worked his way inside the tunnel. The fit was tight and he could barely breathe, but there was still enough room to wiggle, and to move forward while dragging his backpack behind. What worried Amon was that Melchi had said this was the easy part. Amon continued to crawl forward, and with every foot the tunnel grew darker. Eventually he would use the torch in his backpack, but for now he would just have to feel his way along. That wouldn't be so bad, he thought, if it wasn't for the rat droppings under his fingers. Amon's heart started pounding at the thought he might come face to face with a rat while trapped in this burrow, but he forced himself forward. The wall of the temple foundation was as wide as a house. Amon pulled himself along until he reached the other side. He couldn't see a thing now, but suddenly felt his head and shoulders pop out into an open space. He pulled himself through until he was standing in blackness. He felt in every direction and discovered nothing above his head, or to his right or left, but directly in front of him was another wall. Amon opened his pack and felt around until he had the flint, steel, and tinder. Working by feel, he piled the tinder on the ground, then struck the flint against the steel. The clink of the steel echoed through the chamber, and sparks flew with each strike. On the third hit of the tinder started to smolder. He bent down and blew softly until it erupted in flames. Seconds later, he had the torch lit. Now Amon could see. Behind him was the outer wall he just climbed through. In front of him was the wall of the inner foundation. To his right, the empty space between the walls, and above him, high above him, arched partitions that locked the 2 walls together. To the left were the tops of huge cisterns, wells under the temple that collected rainwater for drinking and bathing. Amon also noticed that his fingers, toes, knees, and elbows were bloody from the climb up the rocks and crawl through the tunnel. But sometimes a man has to get bloody to do what men have to do, he thought. He must ignore the pain and push ahead. In this case, ahead meant to his right. There was barely enough room for Amon to walk between the walls, and the space was thick with spider webs. He pushed through with the torch, all the time worrying about rats. Melchi had said to go 30 paces in this direction, and Amon tried his best to count them off now, even as his nose and stomach wanted to rebel at the stink of the rat droppings. At 30 paces, Amon stopped and looked up. He was directly between 2 of the overhead archways, but couldn't see what he was looking for. With a sigh of resignation and hoping that Melchi knew what he spoke of, Amon once again started climbing. This time, the climbing was much more difficult because he had to hold on to the torch as he searched out finger holds and toe holds. It felt like hours to Amon as he climbed straight up, then to his left and right, searching for the opening Malachi had said would be there. After a time, Amon started to wonder if the opening existed at all, or if it had been sealed off over the years. When he reached the roof of the space, Amon began to panic. Not only was he exhausted and his fingers slippery with sweat and blood, but there was no opening as Melchi had said. Besides, it was well after sunrise and the Romans would begin executing people at any time. He might already be too late. Amon swallowed and forced his heart to stop pounding. A man must use his head, he told himself. Hanging on the side of the wall in the middle of the smelly canyon in the dark, this was easy to say but hard to do. Think, Amon scolded himself. His toes were starting to ache now and his fingers to throb, but he closed his eyes and pictured it in his head. Melchi would have been a young man when he worked on the temple. Young men like to strut around as if everything they do is important, so 30 paces to young Melchi would be a farther distance than 30 paces to a 13-year-old. Amon opened his eyes and quickly started climbing to his right. He had to drop down a short distance to get under the next archway, but when he came up on the other side, there it was, a rectangular opening in the inner wall, just as Melchi had described. Now the only question was, how was Amon ever going to fit through that hole? His torch was beginning to fade and Amon knew he must hurry. He pushed it through the hole to lead the way, then stuck his head inside. His shoulders hit either side of the wall and stopped him from going farther, but by twisting and bending and scrunching, he forced his way in, pulling his backpack with his toes. Now his mind started inventing things for him to be afraid of, and once again Amon started to panic. What if I get stuck in here? He wondered as the walls of the tunnel squeezed him like a fist. What if there's an earthquake and I'm trapped in here? What if the rats... Stop it, Amon, he silently yelled at himself. Just keep going and trust in Jehovah. And so he forced his mind to think only of the path ahead, and in what seemed like a very short time, his head popped out into an open chamber. Quickly, Amon pulled himself through the opening and stood up. Now he was in a proper tunnel, part of the drainage system to collect rainwater in cisterns below. At this time of year, though, the tunnels were dry. Knowing he might already be out of time, Amon turned to his left toward Antonia and ran on tiptoe down the tunnel. Every once in a while he would pass an opening the size of his fist in the ceiling. Those must drain water from the surface of the temple courts, Amon decided. Light and fresh air passed through these drain holes such that he almost didn't need his torch. It was while moving under one of these vents that Amon thought he heard a crowd yelling, "Crucify him!" It must be my mind playing tricks on me, Amon thought. Just as he was thinking this, Amon reached a corner in the tunnel where it turned to the right. He followed it around and counted out 20 paces, adding 4 more for Malachi's youthful strides, and there was the shaft Malachi had promised. The shaft was on the outside northern wall of the Temple Mount, the wall it shared with the fortress of Antonia. According to Melchi's explanations, the shaft dropped from this level all the way down to the cisterns below the prison cells. Another waterway fed off to the left and right of the shaft at the level of the cells, and each cell drained directly into that waterway. All Amon had to do was climb down the shaft, cross through the waterway to the right, find the drain hole to his father's cell, enlarge it with the tools he'd brought, and rescue his father. But first, there was the matter of the grating. The shaft was covered with a metal grate locked with pins. Melchi had said that the pins holding the cover over the shaft should be rusted out by now and snap right off. Amon did not find that to be so. He first tried pulling off the bars, but he couldn't even make them wriggle. Then he tried prying the grating off with a metal rod, but the rod just bent. His hands started to slip on the tools as sweaty panic took over. What if I can't get the cover off, he thought. What if they take my father just as I get to his cell? Amon took a hammer and chisel out of his pack and lightly tapped on one of the pins. The sound bounced back and forth along the tunnel, so loud that Amon was sure it would wake Pilot from a sound sleep on the other side of the city. But the pin didn't break. He hit it again and again, harder and louder each time, but the steel lock was barely dented. For hours it seemed Amon cut away at the pin. After a while he quit worrying about the sound. Finally, heaving great breaths and covered with sweat, he felt the pin snap. Amon sat back, his arms throbbing from the hard work. That was one, he thought. 3 more to go. Hours later, Amon cut through the last of the 4 pins, holding the grate in place. He fell backward, exhausted, every muscle in his body burning in pain. He closed his eyes and knew he could go no farther. He had no more strength. He was finished. But then, images of his father being crucified once again marched across Amon's mind. So he pushed himself to his knees, threw aside the grating, and almost forgetting his tools, dove into the shaft. He found the rats. Though he had to hold his torch overhead in order to squeeze down the shaft, Amon could hear the rats below him. Thousands of them, it seemed, their squeaking echoing off the walls. Amon froze in place for several moments, the terror in his mind overtaking the desperation of his heart. He began to cry in panic and frustration, but then anger at his own weakness forced his feet to continue climbing down the rough bricks of the shaft. A rat squeaked in his ear. Amon screamed and knocked the rat away with his torch. It had been sitting on the ledge formed by the bricks, a ledge exactly like the ones he was using for footholds. But he hadn't seen it. Realizing now that he might step on a rat or put his foot in front of one with every step, Amon could go no further. He was 20 feet away from saving his father, but he was stuck in the shaft, paralyzed with fear. His father was going to die because of a tunnel of rats.